Picture a plain in western Turkey, just before dawn, sometime in the dead of winter, 190 BC. A cold fog rolled in rivers that box in this valley, so thick that a man can barely see the standard of his own unit. Somewhere out there in that gray soup stand 70,000 soldiers, scythed chariots with blades bolted to their axles, armored horsemen sheathed head to hoof in iron, 54 war elephants, archers on camelback from the Arabian frontier, 16,000 pikemen packed shoulder to shoulder, holding spears 20 feet long, and facing them, maybe half that number of Romans. The man commanding that enormous army had marched farther east than any Greek since Alexander. He'd been given the title the Great. He had Hannibal, yes, that Hannibal, living at his court as a guest. He had every advantage of numbers, terrain, and cavalry. By nightfall, his empire would be finished as a Mediterranean power, and the way of war that had ruled the world for 140 years would be exposed as a beautiful, expensive fossil. This is the Battle of Magnesia, and it's the day the Sarissa lost to the sword. The king wanted to be Alexander. To understand what happened on that plain, you have to understand the man who lost. Antiochus III inherited the Seleucid Empire as a teenager in 223 BC. On paper, it was the largest of the kingdoms carved out of Alexander's corpse, stretching from the Aegean coast all the way toward the Hindu Kush. In practice, it was falling apart, provinces in revolt, governors declaring themselves kings, a treasury bleeding out. So Antiochus did something almost nobody expected. He fixed it. For 7 years he marched east on a campaign the Greeks called the Anabasis, the march up country. Media, Parthia, Bactria, and finally over the mountains into the Kabul Valley, where he made a treaty with an Indian king and collected war elephants like other monarchs collected wine. He came home with the empire stitched back together, and a nickname that stuck, Megas, the Great. Then he beat the Ptolemies of Egypt and took Syria and Palestine. Then he turned west toward the rich Greek cities of the Aegean coast. Then he crossed into Europe, and that's where he ran into a problem he'd never faced before. A republic in Italy that had just spent 17 years being torn apart by Hannibal, and had won anyway. Roms and the king talk past each other. The Romans had just finished Philip V of Macedon at Cynocephalae in 197 BC. They declared the Greeks free, which meant something very specific in Roman. Free from anyone except Rome. So when Antiochus started rebuilding the city of Lysimachia on the European side of the Hellespont, Roman envoys showed up and told him to go home. Antiochus was baffled. He was reclaiming land his ancestors had held. What business was it of Italians? He pointed out, not unreasonably, that Rome had no historic stake in Asia Minor at all. The Romans replied that if he wanted them to stay out of Asia, he could start by staying out of Europe. Neither side backed down. Meanwhile, in the winter of 196 and 195 BC, a fugitive turned up at Antiochus's court in Ephesus. Hannibal Barca, driven out of Carthage, offering his services to any king willing to fight Rome. That single fact hardened opinion in the Senate more than a dozen diplomatic incidents. Antiochus wasn't just a rival now. He was harboring the ghost of Cana, a war that went wrong from the start in 192 BC. The Aetolian League in central Greece invited Antiochus to come and liberate them. He came with about 10,000 men, not an invasion force, a gesture. He seems to have genuinely believed the Greeks would rise up and join him in the tens of thousands. They didn't. Philip of Macedon, calculating coldly, sided with Rome. The Achaeans declared war on Antiochus, and in April of 191 BC, a Roman army caught him at Thermopylae, the same pass, the same trick with the mountain path, and shattered his little army. Antiochus fled back to Asia with a handful of survivors. Then it got worse. The Romans and their allies from Rhodes and Pergamon beat the Seleucid fleet at Corycus. Hannibal himself, given command of a squadron, was beaten by the Rhodians near the Eurymedon River. And at Myonessus in 190 BC, Seleucid naval power in the Aegean simply ended, which meant the sea road to Asia was open. And for the first time in history, a Roman army prepared to cross into Asia. The Scipios cross over. The consul in charge was Lucius Cornelius Scipio, competent but not a legend. His brother, however, was Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, the man who had beaten Hannibal at Zama 11 years earlier. Africanus came along as a legatus, an advisor, and everyone on both sides understood who the real brain of the operation was. Antiochus, sensing the danger, tried to negotiate. He offered to pull out of Europe entirely. He offered to pay half of Rome's war costs. He even released Scipio Africanus's captured son without ransom, hoping to buy goodwill. The Senate's answer was essentially, not enough. Rome wanted the whole thing settled, permanently. And then fate handed Antiochus a gift he couldn't use. Scipio Africanus fell ill and had to stay behind at Aelia. The greatest general Rome had ever produced would miss the battle entirely. The Roman army, around 30,000 strong, joined by King Eumenes II of Pergamon and his troops, marched inland. Antiochus moved to meet them near Magnesia ad Sipylum, in the shadow of a mountain, on ground he'd chosen himself. The standoff for days, the two armies stared at each other across 4 kilometers of plain. Antiochus had built a fortified camp and had no reason to leave it. He had the bigger army and vastly superior cavalry. Time was on his side. Every day the Romans sat there, their supply lines got thinner and their forage got scarcer. Scipio knew it. He was in a trap of a different kind. He couldn't storm a fortified camp defended by 70,000 men. He couldn't retreat without wrecking morale and handing Antiochus a propaganda victory. And there was a clock ticking that had nothing to do with the enemy. Back in Rome, elections were coming, and a new consul would arrive in spring to take over the command and, more importantly, the glory. So Scipio did the only thing left. He walked his army forward to a spot where the river no longer covered his right flank and dared the king to come out. Antiochus looked at that exposed flank, saw room for his cavalry to work, and took the bait. Legend has it that somewhere in this period, the king showed off his glittering army to Hannibal and asked whether it would be enough for the Romans. Hannibal, dry as ever, replied that yes, it would be quite enough for the Romans. Greedy as they are, Antiochus, the story goes, did not enjoy the joke. Dawn in the fog, the armies formed up in a mist so heavy it soaked bowstrings and slings and killed visibility. That fog would matter more than anyone realized. Antiochus's line was a museum of Hellenistic warfare. In the center, 16,000 phalangites, drilled in the Macedonian style, split into 10 blocks of 1,600 men each, 50 across and 32 deep. In the gaps between the blocks, pairs of war elephants with towers on their backs, meant to look like living fortresses stitched into the wall of pikes. On the left, his son Seleucus with cavalry, cataphracts, Galatians, and Cappadocians. On the right, Antiochus himself with the best troops in the empire. 3,000 cataphracts, the royal Aegean, the silver shields, Dahai horse archers from the steppe. Out front on the left, scythed chariots and camel riders from Arabia. The Romans kept it simple. 2 blocks of about 10,800 heavy infantry. Romans and Italian allies in the standard 3-line checkerboard. Young men in front, veterans behind, each maniple able to move on its own. On the right, Eumenes with the allied cavalry. 16 African elephants held in reserve, and the Roman commanders knew perfectly well those animals were smaller and weaker than the Indian beasts across the field. They kept them out of it, 30,000 against 70,000. And in the fog, the Seleucid line was so long that Antiochus, on the far right, could not see his own center. Humans seized the flow. The battle opened with a man nobody expected to be the hero. Eumenes of Pergamon had spent his whole reign being bullied by Antiochus. He also knew exactly how scythed chariots worked, and more importantly, how they failed. Chariots need horses. Horses need nerve. So instead of receiving the charge, Eumenes sent his light troops forwards, archers, slingers, javelin men, swarming out ahead of the line and pelting the chariot teams. They shot at the horses. They screamed. They kept moving. The teams broke. And when a scythed chariot panics, it doesn't stop being a weapon. It just changes sides. Those blades came whirling back through the Seleucid left, straight into the camels and then into the ranks of the cataphracts, who were still trying to sort themselves out. Eumenes saw the disorder and charged into it before it could be fixed. That was it. The entire left wing of the Seleucid army, thousands of the most heavily armored horsemen in the world, turned and ran for camp. The Galatians and Cappadocians next to them were hit from two directions and fell back. The Phalanx's left side was now naked. The king wins his battle and loses the war, and here's the cruel irony. At the same moment, on the other end of the field, Antiochus was winning. He led the charge himself at 52 years old, straight into the Roman left with his cataphracts and guard cavalry. The Roman line there buckled. Then it broke. Legionaries ran for their own camp with the king of Asia riding them down. If the story ended there, we'd be talking about Magnesia as a Seleucid triumph, but a military tribune named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was at that camp. He met the fleeing men at the rampart with drawn weapons and orders to cut down anyone who kept running. The rout stopped. Thracian and Macedonian volunteers stiffened the line, and Antiochus, with cavalry, not siege troops, found himself stuck, hacking uselessly at a fortified camp. He was winning a fight that no longer mattered. Behind him, unseen in the fog and the dust, his army was dying. The Phalanx breaks in the center. The Phalanx did what a phalanx does. It held. Roman infantry could not get through that hedge of pikes. They tried, and they failed, and they backed off. For a while, the 16,000 were the most solid thing on the field. But solid is not the same as safe. With both flanks gone, the Romans and Pergamenes simply surrounded them and stopped trying to close. Instead, they threw things, javelins, arrows, sling bullets, from every angle, hour after hour. A phalangite carries a tiny shield strapped to his arm because both hands are on the pike. He cannot cover himself. He cannot chase skirmishers. He cannot turn. The formation began to withdraw, still in order, still intact. A fighting square walking backward off the field. It might have worked. Then the elephants broke. 20 animals wedged into the gaps between the pike blocks, stung by hundreds of missiles, with nowhere to run except through their own infantry. They ran. Towers, drivers, and tons of terrified muscle tore the phalanx open from the inside. And the moment there were gaps, the Romans went in with the gladius. At sword's length, a man holding a 20-foot pike is not a soldier. He's a target. The phalangites threw down their weapons and ran. By the time Antiochus finally turned his cavalry around and rode back, he found no army at all, just a field of his own dead, and Romans looting his camp. Livy claims 53,000 Seleucid dead against 349 Romans. That's ancient bookkeeping, and modern historians don't buy it. The usual estimates run closer to 10,000 Seleucid dead and perhaps 5,000 Roman. Either way, the outcome wasn't in doubt. Antiochus fled to Sardis. Within weeks, his cities began surrendering without a fight. He sued for peace almost immediately. The terms, finalized as the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC, were designed to end him as a great power forever. 15,000 talents of silver, one of the largest indemnities in ancient history, paid out over 12 years. Total withdrawal from everything west of the Taurus Mountains. His navy cut to 10 ships. His war elephants surrendered. 20 hostages sent to Rome, including his own son, the future Antiochus IV, and a demand to hand over Hannibal, who slipped away before it could happen, and drank poison in Bithynia a few years later rather than be taken. Rome annexed nothing, not 1 acre. It handed the spoils to Pergamon and Rhodes and sailed home, having discovered something more useful than territory, that it could break the greatest kingdom on earth, and then simply decide who ruled the pieces. Antiochus the Great died in 187 BC, killed in Elima, while trying to strip a temple of its treasure to make his payments to Rome. Magnesia is where the Hellenistic world found out it was over. The phalanx wasn't beaten because it was weak. It was never broken from the front. It was beaten because it was rigid. It needed flat ground, protected flanks, and a commander watching the whole field. The legion needed none of those things. Its maniples could turn, split, wheel, and fight in the gaps. And Roman commanders at Magnesia won by refusing the phalanx's strength and attacking everything around it. 22 years later at Pydna, Macedon would learn exactly the same lesson. Then Greece became a province. Then Pergamon was left to Rome in a will. Then Syria itself, in 63 BC, was quietly annexed by Pompey. The last shrunken remnant of Antiochus's empire folded up and put away. There's a detail in this story that's hard to shake. Antiochus III spent his entire life trying to be Alexander. marching to India, collecting elephants, earning the title, the Great. He got everything Alexander had. The empire, the reputation, the army of 100 nations. He just got it 2 centuries too late, against an enemy that didn't care about any of it. Sometimes an era doesn't end with a slow decline. Sometimes it ends on one foggy morning in a valley in Anatolia, when a king wins his corner of the battlefield and turns around to find the world has moved on without him.